"Will you marry our father?" The two little girls asked the question so softly that for a moment the wind nearly carried it away. The stranger they asked was not a woman anyone would normally notice, much less invite into a family. Her coat was torn, her boots were cracked, and soot darkened the hem of her skirt like the shadow of a fire that had followed her across miles of winter road. Yet what happened after those quiet words would slowly change the lives of everyone in the small frontier town of Red Hollow. Long before anyone understood what those girls had done, before the whispers in town, and before the promise that would one day be spoken beside the creek, there was only a cold evening, a locked church door, and a widow who had nearly forgotten what it felt like to belong anywhere at all. The wind came hard across the open land that evening, pushing snow sideways through the cottonwood trees and burying the narrow road that led into town. Wagons had already passed earlier that day, leaving deep frozen ruts that were now filling with drifting powder. Through that pale storm walked a woman alone. Her name was Clara Whitfield. She moved carefully, one step at a time, her shoulders pulled tight beneath a faded wool shawl that no longer kept out the cold. The long road behind her had taken weeks. She had crossed hills, creeks, and quiet farms where people watched from windows but rarely opened their doors. Clara had stopped asking after the first few towns. Winter had a way of making people guard what little warmth they had left. Her boots had once been strong leather, but now the soles were thin and the seams had split open along the sides. Each step let in snow that melted slowly against her feet. She barely noticed anymore. The cold was simple, honest. It told the truth about the world. What had broken her was not the cold. It was the silence that followed the fire months ago, the long nights when no one spoke her name anymore. Once, she had lived in a small farmhouse near the ridge outside a place called Millhaven. Her husband had built the porch himself and planted lilacs along the fence. Inside the house there had been laughter, warm bread cooling by the window, and a cradle that rocked softly in the evenings. Then one night, a lantern tipped over in the barn. The flames climbed faster than anyone could run. By morning there was nothing left but black beams and drifting ash. Her husband had not escaped. Neither had the baby boy who had only just learned to open his eyes to the world. Clara had walked away from the ruins before the smoke finished rising. Since then she had carried the smell of soot with her everywhere she went, no matter how many rivers she washed in or how long the wind blew across her clothes. When she finally reached the edge of Red Hollow, the church bell rang somewhere in the distance, calling the few remaining townsfolk to evening prayer. The sound rolled low across the snow-covered roofs. Chimneys breathed thin lines of smoke into the darkening sky. Lamps flickered in windows. But no one stood outside. The streets were nearly empty, and the town had the quiet feeling of a place that preferred not to be disturbed after sundown. Clara paused beside the wooden sign that marked the town's edge. The paint had faded until only the name remained clear. She stood there for a moment, gathering the strength to keep moving, then stepped onto the main road. Two boys were playing near a porch, rolling a stick through the snow like it was a wheel. When they saw Clara approach, they stopped. Their laughter faded quickly as they took in the sight of her soot-dark skirt and wind-burned face. Without saying a word, they ran inside and shut the door behind them. Clara kept walking. She had grown used to that reaction. People saw what they expected to see. A stranger meant trouble. A widow meant sorrow. A woman with smoke-stained clothes meant bad luck had followed her into town. At the general store, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. Warmth rushed toward her from a potbelly stove glowing red. In the corner, the smell of flour, leather, and lamp oil filled the small room. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Hattie Barlow, a narrow woman with gray hair pinned tightly behind her head. She was counting coins into a wooden tray. Clara cleared her throat quietly. She said she could sweep the floor, carry sacks, or fold cloth in exchange for a little food or a place to sit until the storm passed. Mrs. Barlow looked up slowly. Her eyes moved over Clara the way someone inspects a cracked dish to see if it can still hold water. She said she remembered hearing about the Whitfield farm burning near Millhaven. She said the loss had been terrible. Then she added that winter was hard enough without strangers asking for favors. Clara nodded once. She had expected as much. She stepped back outside into the cold without another word. The church stood across the square with tall wooden doors and a narrow bell tower rising above the roof. Clara climbed the steps and tried the handle. Locked. She leaned for a moment against the railing, her breath thin in the freezing air. Snow gathered quietly along the boards of the porch. The town around her felt distant and closed, as though every home had already decided she did not belong. She did not cry. Tears had long since run dry. Instead, she stared out at the empty square and wondered how far she might walk before her strength gave out. That was when she heard small footsteps behind her. They were uneven and light, almost lost beneath the wind. Clara turned slowly. Two little girls stood near the edge of the road. They looked about 6 years old and were nearly identical, their dark hair tangled by the storm and their coats far too thin for the weather. One of them held a wooden button in her mittened hand. The other clutched a broken silver locket hanging from a string around her neck. They were watching Clara carefully, not with fear, but with curiosity. The louder twin stepped forward first and asked if she was cold. Clara almost smiled at the question. The quieter girl moved closer and reached out, brushing her fingers against the hem of Clara's skirt. When she pulled her hand back, her fingertips were smudged with black soot. She studied the mark like it was something important. The louder twin tilted her head and said they had been looking for someone. Clara asked who. The girl glanced at her sister before answering in a voice so calm it barely sounded like a question at all. A wife for our father. Then the quiet twin looked straight into Clara's tired eyes and asked the words that would echo through the rest of their lives. Will you marry him? No one in Red Hollow could later agree on the exact moment the stranger stopped being a guest and quietly became part of the Carter house. Some said it was the morning Clara Whitfield braided the twins' hair before breakfast. Others believed it was the night she stayed awake rocking one of the girls through a nightmare while their father stood helpless in the doorway. But the truth was simpler. It happened slowly, one small moment at a time, until leaving felt stranger than staying. The night the twins first brought Clara home, she had only planned to warm her hands by the fire and continue her journey at dawn. Daniel Carter had barely spoken when Lily and Lila burst through the door shouting that they had found him a bride. He had looked surprised, maybe even uncomfortable, but he had not sent her away. Instead, he placed a bowl of stew on the table and nodded toward the empty chair beside the fire. Clara remembered how the heat sank into her bones while the twins sat close to her, studying her like curious sparrows. Daniel was a quiet man, tall and broad with the steady hands of someone used to hard work. A thin scar crossed his brow, and he moved through the house with calm, careful steps. When Clara tried to leave later that night, slipping toward the door so she wouldn't trouble them, Daniel stopped her with a simple question. You got somewhere better to go? She didn't answer. He watched her for a moment, then nodded toward the hallway. You can stay till you do. That was all. No questions about her past. No expectations for the morning. Just a place to rest. Clara slept in a small room that smelled faintly of cedar and soap. She didn't sleep deeply, but she lay awake listening to the quiet sounds of the house settling in the cold night. Morning came slowly. Frost clung to the windows, and pale sunlight stretched across the floor. When Clara stepped into the kitchen, Daniel was already awake heating water on the stove. Without a word, he placed a tin cup of coffee in front of her. The simple gesture warmed her more than the fire. Soon the twins wandered in, hair tangled and eyes heavy with sleep. Lily climbed onto the bench beside Clara without hesitation, while Lila studied her quietly from across the table. After a moment, Lily asked the question that seemed most important to her. Can you braid hair? Clara nodded, and the girls immediately sat between her knees like it had already been decided. Her fingers moved slowly through the knots in their hair, careful and gentle. When she finished, the girls ran to the window to admire the uneven braids in the reflection. Daniel watched the scene for a moment before pulling on his coat and heading outside to split wood. Clara told herself she would leave that afternoon, but the snow on the road had grown deep again, and Daniel never asked her to go. Instead, he fixed the loose seam in her boot while she helped the twins gather eggs from the chicken coop. Days passed quietly after that. Clara began helping around the house without being asked. She washed dishes after supper, swept the wooden floors, and mended shirts that had torn along the sleeves. The twins followed her everywhere, talking endlessly about small things. How Lily believed the chickens understood her, or how Lila once tried to teach a frog to sit like a dog. Their laughter filled the rooms in a way that made the house feel less lonely. Even Daniel seemed to notice. One evening, Clara baked bread using the last of the flour. The loaf browned too quickly and split across the top, but the twins tore into it with excitement. Daniel ate his portion quietly before giving a single nod. Somehow that nod felt like praise. Yet the town of Red Hollow began to notice the stranger living in the Carter house. The whispers started at the general store when Clara went to buy thread. People watched her longer than before. Mrs. Barlow's smile looked thin and curious, the kind meant more for observing than welcoming. By the time Clara walked back to the farmhouse, she could almost feel the rumors spreading ahead of her. A widow living in a man's house. 2 little girls growing attached to her. No ring. No explanation. One afternoon, Lily asked the question Clara had quietly feared. "Can we call you Mama?" The word struck Clara like a sudden gust of cold air. Daniel looked up from the table, his expression unreadable. Clara knelt beside the girls and brushed their hair gently behind their ears. "Maybe just Clara for now," she said softly. The twins accepted the answer easily, but the moment stayed with her long after they ran outside to play. That evening, Clara sat alone on the porch watching the sunset fade across the snowy fields. Daniel stepped outside and leaned against the railing beside her. They stayed silent for a long time before Clara finally asked the question that had been growing quietly in her chest. "What am I here, Daniel?" He thought for a moment before answering. "You're here," he said simply. It wasn't a promise, but somehow it felt like the beginning of one. Spring slowly returned to Red Hollow, melting the last snow along the roads and bringing people back out of their homes. With them came the whispers that had been quietly growing about Clara Whitfield living in Daniel Carter's house. Some said it wasn't proper. Others said the twins deserved a real mother. Clara tried to ignore the gossip, but one afternoon 3 men from town rode up to the Carter gate and told Daniel that things needed to be made right. Either Clara should leave, or Daniel should marry her. Months earlier, Clara might have walked away without a fight, the same way she had walked away from every closed door after the fire. But now things were different. She had cooked in that kitchen, braided the twins' hair every morning, and carried one of them home through a winter storm. This house was no longer just shelter, it had become something more. That night, as Clara sat quietly on the porch, Lily and Lila ran to her with a small wooden box filled with crooked drawings. In every picture were 4 people standing beside the little farmhouse, and above them the twins had tried to write one word again and again: Mama. When Daniel saw the drawings, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring. Looking at Clara, he finally asked the question the twins had asked first: "Will you stay and marry me?" Clara thought of the long road that had brought her there, and the 2 small voices that had chosen her when the world had not. This time she didn't hesitate. She said yes. A few days later, they married quietly beside the creek with only the twins watching. Years later, people in Red Hollow would say the Carter house was the warmest place in the valley, not because of the fire in the hearth, but because a stranger who once arrived with nothing had been given a family, and she chose them right back.